Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a seemingly innocent family photo from 1895 that, upon closer inspection, revealed an impossible and chilling secret that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. History is not always found in leather-bound books or grand monuments. Far more often, it resides in the quiet places, whispering from the forgotten corners of the world, from the profound silence of an object left behind. It breathes in the dust motes, dancing in a sliver of light, and it waits patiently in the scent of decaying paper. And sometimes, history's most terrible, most violent truths hide in the most innocent of vessels, a simple family photograph. Our story begins in one such quiet place, an attic in the heart of Seville, Spain, a chamber sealed against the march of time. The air here is a physical presence, thick with the layered scents of cedar wood from old chests, the sharp, dry perfume of brittle paper, and the ghosts of a century's worth of unopened air. The historian, Carmen Rodriguez, a woman whose hands were accustomed to the delicate surgery of the past, moves with a reverent slowness. It is here, among the spectral shapes of furniture slumbering under white shrouds, that Elena Mendoza, the family's final heir at 78, has brought her. Elena's mission is practical, to catalog her family's artifacts before the ancestral home is sold. But Carmen senses a deeper, unspoken purpose, an appeal, a quiet plea for answers. Among piles of yellowed letters, bound in ribbon and gowns of silk, now as fragile as a butterfly's wings, Elena retrieves the object. It is not large, but it feels weighted, heavy with significance. It is a portrait, held in an ornate, sterling silver frame, its surface intricately carved with floral motifs, now tarnished to a soft, leaden gray by the slow breath of time. The photograph, dated 1895, is a perfect tableau of prosperity, a moment of gilded age pride frozen in the warm, amber hue of a flawless albumen print. The quality is exceptional, a testament to the skill of the studio, likely one of Seville's best. A wealthy family is arranged in the sun-dappled courtyard of their Andalusian home. The patriarch, Francisco Mendoza, with his impeccably manicured mustache and fine wool frock coat, exudes an unbending, stern pride. Beside him, his wife, Isabel, her form cinched by a corset into the era's fashionable ideal, projects a quiet, almost fragile, upper-class restraint. Her hand rests on her husband's shoulder, a gesture of possession that feels more like an anchor in a storm. The two boys, Andre and Miguel, are miniature versions of their father, imprisoned in their sailor suits, their faces scrubbed and serious for the camera's unblinking eye. But they are all just dummies and new supporting players, the true gravitational center of the image, the point to which the eye is inescapably drawn, is the girl. This is Esperanza Mendoza, age 8. She stands slightly apart from the others, clad in a dress of brilliant white lace, a confection of innocence that should make her seem ethereal. Her eyes, however, tell a different story entirely in the posed stillness of the photograph. Esperanza's gaze is a searing, living thing. They stare directly into the lens, not with the shy curiosity of a child, but with a fierce, unnerving intensity. An ancient, knowing quality that seems to belong to a soul 1,000 years old. It is as if she is looking not at the photographer, but through him, through the glass plate, through the very fabric of 100 years of time, to lock eyes with Carmen herself. There's a secret in that gaze, a terrible burden that no 8-year-old should ever have to carry. A professional chill, cold and sharp, crawls up Carmen's spine. This is no longer a simple cataloging job. This is an encounter. She moves the photograph toward the attic's lone arched window, letting the hazy afternoon light of Seville spill across its glossy, perfect surface. The silver frame feels cool against her gloved fingertips. And that is when she sees it. A detail so infinitesimal, so masterfully hidden in the delicate filigree of lace at Esperanza's throat, that it would be invisible to any casual observer. With the practiced, laser focus of a historian trained to find the single misplaced thread in a vast tapestry, Carmen squints. Her heart, which had been beating at a calm, professional rhythm, gives a sudden, hard thud against her ribs. She retrieves her specialist's magnifying glass from her leather satchel, its polished brass handle gleaming in the dim light. She holds the lens over the image of the small girl. The world outside the glass blurs. There is only Esperanza now, under the powerful magnification. The detail resolves into focus with shocking clarity. It is a small, metallic pendant, partially obscured. But it is not the pendant itself that makes the air leave Carmen's lungs in a silent gasp. It is the inscription, letters and numbers, carved with a cold, impossibly precise technique. R, H, C, and below it, a date 1623. Something impossible, something that shattered the known history of this family, something that defied the very laws of time. To understand the horrifying anomaly captured in that photograph, one must understand the stage upon which this tragedy was set. The Seville of the late 19th century, the era of Spain's restoration, was a city of dazzling, dangerous contradictions. It was a golden bowl filled with poison, under the brilliant Andalusian sun. It was a gilded stage, a place where merchant families like the Mendozas built dynastic fortunes on olive oil, wine, and transatlantic trade. They displayed their wealth in opulent mansions lining the Calle Sierpes, in private boxes at the opera, and in the extravagant pageantry of Holy Week processions. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, and the air was perfumed with a heady mix of orange blossoms, cigar smoke, and old money. But beneath this shimmering, prosperous surface, Seville had another, darker self. It was a world of shadows and murky undercurrents, a labyrinth of ancient grudges and modern corruption. It was a city where power and influence were the real currency, capable of bending justice into any shape desired. A city official could be persuaded to lose a key document. A Guardia Civil captain could be convinced to look the other way, all for the right price, or for the right family name. Networks of influence, forged in exclusive gentlemen's clubs and sealed with a handshake in a dimly lit tavern, ensured that the rigid social order was maintained. In this world, secrets were a commodity, and they could be buried as easily and as permanently as the dead. It was in this dual landscape of ostentatious wealth and deeply rooted rot that the Mendoza family's tragedy was allowed to fester and bloom. Their house, a grand structure of stone and wrought iron, was more than a symbol of their status. It was a silent witness, a character in this drama, built in the early 1800s in the neoclassical style. Its foundations were far older, sunk deep into the earth and resting upon the stone remnants of a 17th century Baroque mansion that had belonged to a forgotten aristocrat. The house, like Seville itself, was built upon layers of history, upon the ghosts of other people's lives. Its thick walls had absorbed the sounds of celebration and sorrow, of whispered conspiracies and desperate prayers. The attic where Carmen now stood was not just a storage room, it was the house's memory, a time capsule where the echoes of a century-old tragedy still clung to the air, waiting for someone with the patience to listen. For Carmen Rodriguez, a photograph was never just a static image, it was a doorway. She had dedicated her life's work to decoding the silent, frozen narratives of the past. She could read the subtle language of a posed portrait, the unspoken tension in a husband's grip on his wife's chair, the flicker of rebellion in a son's eyes. She was a keeper of these fragile memories, an interpreter for the souls that time had rendered mute. When she looked upon the Mendoza family portrait, she saw more than a family. She saw an intricate, unstable machine, a construct of pride and secrets, hurtling toward a catastrophic failure. And then there was Elena Mendoza, the woman who had summoned her here. At 78, she was the last living link to that failure. The vessel of a generational wound she had inherited but never fully understood. She had grown up in the long shadow of Esperanza, the great aunt who existed only as a tragic myth. The official story, the one polished and repeated for over a century, was always the same Esperanza, a bright, beloved girl, a strong swimmer, had been playing near the Guadalquivir River. She had tragically slipped, hit her head, and drowned. A terrible, senseless accident, an unhealable loss that had irrevocably altered the family spirit. But that was the story told for public consumption, deep within the private annals of the Mendoza clan. There had always been a lingering doubt, a cold spot in the narrative that no one could explain, an accidental death that defied logic. Why was a body found miles downriver, in the bustling port district, a place she had no reason to be? Why had the family seemed so quick to accept the official explanation? Shutting down any further inquiry, the family had lived with these questions, burying them under layers of stoic silence. Elena, in asking Carmen to catalogue her family's heirlooms, wasn't just cleaning out an old house. She was, perhaps unconsciously, making one last attempt at an excavation of the truth. She was searching for closure for a story that had never truly ended. As Carmen, now driven by a professional and personal urgency, began her methodical investigation in the city's municipal archives, the first whispers of that truth began to answer. The archive was a cathedral of silence, filled with the ghosts of official records. After hours of poring over brittle, ink-stained ledgers, she found it. The entry for the death of Esperanza Mendoza, dated October 26, 1895. And there, in the margin, scrawled by an anonymous clerk with a different pen, a hurried, almost frantic hand had added a short explosive note. It consisted of just 2 words, but they were enough to shatter a century of lies. They were enough to confirm the terrible secret in a little girl's eyes. They read, "The suspicious circumstances." The 2 words, "suspicious circumstances," hung in the silent, dusty air of the archive, resonating with a power that reached across a century. They were more than an administrative note. They were a ghost's cry, a final, desperate protest from a forgotten file. For Carmen Rodriguez, these words transformed the faded photograph from a family tragedy into the scene of a potential crime. The intense, knowing gaze of Esperanza Mendoza was no longer just a haunting curiosity. It was an accusation, and the impossible object around her neck, the pendant bearing the date 1623, was no longer just a historical anomaly. It was now Exhibit A. The inscription Artistakis Tuchits, Son, 1623, burned itself into Carmen's mind. It was a clean, precise set of characters that felt utterly alien to the soft, sepia world of the 19th century photograph. Her historian's brain raced, attempting to construct a logical bridge across the 272-year gap. An heirloom. It was possible, but highly improbable for a child to wear such a potentially valuable and ancient piece so casually. A prop from the photography studio, unlikely. Given the deeply personal nature of a family portrait, every rational explanation crumbled under the sheer weight of the anachronism. The pendant felt like a key, but a key to a lock she couldn't yet see. The conflict was no longer just with the past. It was with the very nature of time and evidence itself. Driven by a new, feverish urgency, Carmen plunged deeper into the labyrinthine archives of Seville. She left the civil registry and descended into the older, more cavernous sections of the repository, where the city's property and parish records slumbered. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of decaying parchment and old leather. Here, history was a physical weight. She spent days surrounded by towering shelves of bound volumes, their spines like the bones of forgotten giants. Her gloved fingers, moving with surgical precision, turned pages that crackled like autumn leaves. She was searching for a connection, any thread that could tie the Mendoza family of 1895 to an object from the early 17th century. She traced the deed to the Mendoza house, following its lineage backward through time. The property had been acquired by the Mendozas in the 1820s. Before that, it belonged to a wine merchant, and before him, a minor nobleman. The trail grew colder as she pushed further into the 18th and 17th centuries, the handwriting in the ledgers becoming an ornate, almost illegible scrawl. She found no mention of the initials RHC. The paper trail was a dead end, a formidable wall of silence. The pendant remained an orphan of history, unmoored from any documented context. The initial rush of discovery now gave way to a gnawing frustration. The photograph held a secret. The civil registry confirmed a suspicion, but the archives refused to yield the truth. The past was guarding its story jealously. Carmen knew that documents alone could not solve this. A story is not just ink on paper. It is memory, passed from one generation to the next. She needed a human voice. Her research into the Mendoza's neighborhood led her to a name, a fragile, living link to the Seville of 1895, Dona Remedios Herrera, an 89-year-old woman whose grandmother had been a seamstress for Isabel Mendoza, Esperanza's mother. Finding her felt like a pilgrimage. Carmen located her in a small, sun-filled apartment near the Plaza de San Lorenzo, the air fragrant with chamomile tea and lavender. Doña Remedios was a petite woman, her body frail, but her eyes, nested in a web of wrinkles, were sharp and lucid. They held the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime observing. Carmen presented the photograph carefully, as if it were a sacred relic. The old woman's breath caught in her throat. "Dios mío," she whispered, her gnarled fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the frame. "It's little Esperanza." The name, spoken aloud after so many decades of silence, seemed to fill the room with a tangible sorrow. The memories were not her own, but they were a part of her, a story told to her as a child by her grandmother, a story that had become as real as any of her own experiences. "My grandmother," Doña Remedios began, her voice a soft rustle like dry leaves. She spoke of this child often. She said the girl changed in the weeks before she died. Carmen leaned forward, every fiber of her being focused. This was it. The whisper from the past. She said the girl became obsessed. The old woman continued, obsessed with the history of that house. She would ask strange questions. Who lived here before us? Were there secret rooms? Did they leave anything behind? The seamstress had dismissed it as childish fantasy, but she had noted the girl's intensity. Esperanza was no longer playing. She was searching. The psychological pressure on Carmen was immense. This was no longer an academic exercise. The story had taken root within her, becoming a personal crusade. She felt a profound, almost crushing sense of responsibility to the little girl in the photograph. Esperanza's silent, intense gaze followed her, haunting her waking thoughts and her dreams. It was the gaze of a child who knew a dangerous secret, who had stumbled into a world of adult complexities and paid the ultimate price. Doña Remedios's testimony provided the crucial human context, but Carmen needed to anchor it with official evidence. She returned to the archives, this time requesting the original Guardia Civil report on the drowning, after a lengthy bureaucratic process. A clerk brought her the file. The document was yellowed and brittle, the official language stark and emotionless. It detailed the discovery of the body at the port, the preliminary examination, the interviews with the distraught family, and then Carmen found it. A short paragraph in the inventory of items found on the deceased. The report noted, with cold, bureaucratic precision. The girl was clutching in her right hand a small gold pendant, bearing the initials RHC and the date 1623. The family claims to have no knowledge of the jewel's provenance. Carmen's blood ran cold. It was the same pendant. Esperanza had carried it with her to her death. But the report created a shocking contradiction. The family had denied knowing where it came from. Why? Why would they lie to the authorities about an object their daughter was holding at the moment of her death? Were they protecting someone? Or were they hiding a truth so terrible that they couldn't bear to speak its name? The wall of silence around the Mendoza family was not one of grief. It was one of deliberate concealment. The investigation had reached a critical impasse. The paper trail was contradictory, and the living memory was fading. Carmen realized she had been looking at the mystery from the outside in. She needed to go back to the source, the photograph itself. Who took it? What else might that camera have seen? Municipal records from the era led her to the location of the photography studio that had belonged to Elena's great-grandmother, a woman who, revolutionary for her time, had been a professional photographer. The building, on the bustling Calle Cuna, still stood, though its ground floor had been converted into a chic hat shop. The upper floors were vacant, with a mixture of professional charm and desperate pleading. Carmen convinced the current owner to grant her access to the building's basement, a space that had been used for storage and had remained largely untouched for decades. The air in the basement was cold and damp, smelling of earth and decay. In a far corner, under a pile of rotting canvas, she found them. A treasure trove of abandoned photographic equipment from the 19th century. A large wooden plate camera stood like a sentinel on its tripod, and next to it, carefully wrapped in thick, black paper and sealed with wax, were dozens of undeveloped glass photographic plates. It was a time capsule, a collection of moments that had been captured but never seen. Carmen knew she was holding something incredibly precious. She took the plates to Don Alberto Jimenez, a specialist in historical photographic development, one of the few people left in Spain who still practiced the delicate, almost alchemical art of 19th century developing techniques. His laboratory was a dark, quiet space, filled with the sharp scent of chemicals. "The plates are in remarkable condition," Don Alberto murmured, his voice full of reverence as he examined them under a safe light. "The seal was excellent. We should be able to recover the images." For the next several hours, Carmen and Don Alberto worked in near silence, watching as ghosts began to emerge from the glass. One by one, images swam into existence in the developing trays. Most were what they expected stern-faced merchants, society ladies draped in pearls, children dressed in their Sunday best. They were the prosperous face of Seville, captured for posterity. Carmen's heart sank with each new, ordinary portrait. Perhaps this, too, was a dead end. And then, the final plate was submerged in the developer. An image began to appear, but this one was different. It was not a portrait. It was an interior scene, an old, sparsely furnished room, with heavy, dark wood furniture and tapestries on the walls. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, an array of objects were laid out as if for an inventory: old documents, a collection of jewelry, a silver box, and there, placed prominently in the center of the collection, was the pendant, identical to the one Esperanza wore. Undeniable, extraordinary, Don Alberto whispered. Look at the edge of the plate. Scratched into the glass was a date: 1894. Carmen grabbed a magnifying glass, her hand shaking. Next to the pendant on the table lay a document, its text partially visible, but the initials at the top were clear as day: H.C. It appeared to be a legal document, a will, from a much earlier era. The photograph was an inventory of a 17th century estate, taken just 1 year before Esperanza's death. This was the great revelation, the moment the entire case pivoted. The initials were no longer a mystery. They were a name. Armed with this new explosive evidence, Carmen returned to the historical archives, but her search was now completely transformed. She was no longer looking for the Mendozas. She was hunting for a ghost from the 17th century named R.H.C. She bypassed the 19th century records and went straight to the oldest, most fragile volumes, and there, in a dusty tome of last wills and testaments from the 1640s, she found him, Don Rodrigo Herrera de la Cruz, a fantastically wealthy spice merchant who had lived and died in the very mansion upon whose foundations the Mendoza house was built. The will was a long, elaborate document, but one section made Carmen's heart stop. Don Rodrigo, having lost his entire family to a plague epidemic, wrote that he had no direct heirs, fearing his vast fortune would be seized by the crown or distant, undeserving relatives. He had converted it into gold and jewels and hidden it within the bones of his house. And to guide a worthy future discoverer, he had created 3 identical gold pendants, each engraved with his initials and the year the treasure was hidden: 1623. Each pendant, the will explained, contained a different clue, a piece of a riddle that, when solved together, would lead to the location of his immense, hidden fortune. The truth, when it finally came, was more incredible than anything Carmen could have imagined. Esperanza Mendoza, in her innocent, childish explorations of her old house, had not just found an antique trinket. She had stumbled upon one of the 3 keys to a legendary lost treasure, a secret that had lain dormant for over 2.5 centuries. And in doing so, she had unwittingly resurrected a story of immense greed and, as Carmen was beginning to fear, deadly consequence. The question was no longer what the pendant was. The question was now who else in that house in 1895 knew the legend of Herrera de la Cruz's treasure. The discovery of Don Rodrigo's will was a seismic event, a revelation that reconfigured the entire landscape of the investigation. The legend of the treasure was no longer a legend, it was a documented fact. The pendant was no longer an anomaly, it was a key. But for Carmen Rodriguez, this earth-shattering confirmation brought with it a chilling new clarity. The treasure, as magnificent as it was a distraction. It was the motive, the glittering prize that had set the tragedy in motion. But it was not the heart of the crime. The heart of the crime was the murder of an 8-year-old girl. The focus of the investigation had to pivot, turning away from the ghost of a 17th century merchant and toward the flesh and blood inhabitants of the Mendoza house in the autumn of 1895. The question that now consumed her, eclipsing all others, was terrifyingly simple. Who else knew? The answer, she suspected, would not be found in the city's public archives. It would be in the private archive of the Mendoza family itself. She returned to the old house, to the attic where it had all begun, this time with a specific request for Elena Mendoza. "I need to see everything you have on the people who worked for your family," Carmen stated, her voice calm but firm. "Contracts, letters, payment ledgers, anything that can tell us who was in this house during that time." Elena, her face a mask of hope and dread, led Carmen to an antique mahogany desk in her great-grandfather's study. From a locked drawer, she retrieved a heavy, carved wooden box. "My great-grandmother was meticulous," Elena explained, her voice trembling slightly. "She kept records of everything." The box opened with a soft click, releasing the faint, dry scent of old paper and ink. Inside, nestled in neat bundles tied with faded ribbon, were the domestic employee records for the Mendoza household from 1890 to 1900. This was the irrefutable, tangible evidence Carmen had been searching for. She spent the next hour carefully examining the documents under the light of a desk lamp. The papers painted a picture of a typical, affluent household of the era: a cook, 2 maids, a gardener. The names and details were mundane, unremarkable. And then she found him. The file was thicker than the others, filled with letters of recommendation and detailed notes on his duties. Mauricio Vega, the family's trusted administrator. He was responsible for managing the family's business accounts, overseeing the staff, and acting as Francisco Mendoza's right-hand man, especially when the patriarch traveled. He was a man who had been given complete and total access to the family's life, their finances, and their home. He was a man who held a position of absolute trust. A knot of ice formed in Carmen's stomach. She examined his employment history, which was included with his letters of recommendation. Before joining the Mendoza household, Vega had worked for 2 other prominent families in Seville, both known for their extensive collections of historical artifacts. A quick cross-reference with old newspaper archives, a task that took her a full day at the city's hemeroteca, revealed a disturbing pattern. Both families had reported the mysterious disappearance of valuable objects, a set of silver coins, a rare manuscript shortly after Vega had left their employ. The thefts were never solved, attributed to common burglars. But now, seen through the lens of Esperanza's death, these were not coincidences. They were a professional history. Mauricio Vega was not just an administrator. He was a predator who moved through the world of the wealthy, using their trust as his camouflage. He was a man with a deep knowledge of valuable objects and a demonstrated willingness to acquire them by any means necessary. He was the one person in that house who would have understood the true significance of a small pendant bearing the date 1623. The documents were the skeleton of the crime. Now, Carmen needed to give it flesh and blood. She needed the final piece of the puzzle, the eyewitness account that would place Mauricio Vega at the center of the tragedy. She knew there was only one person left who could provide it. She returned to the small, sunlit apartment of Dona Remedios Herrera, this time carrying not just the family photograph, but a copy of a photograph of Mauricio Vega she had found tucked away in his employee file. The old woman greeted her with a knowing sadness in her eyes, as if she had been expecting this return visit. Carmen didn't speak at first. She simply placed the photograph of Vega on the small table between them. It showed a handsome, well-dressed man in his late 30s, with a confident smile and dark, intelligent eyes. Doña Remedios stared at the photograph for a long, silent minute. Her teacup rattled in its saucer. The lucid clarity in her eyes clouded over with a shadow that was more than a century old. "My God," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "This man, my grandmother, she spoke of him." This was not a confession from the killer, but it was the next best thing, a confession from history itself, delivered through the vessel of a dying woman's memory of her grandmother's trauma. Carmen leaned forward, holding her breath. "My grandmother told me," Doña Remedios said, her gaze fixed on the photograph as if seeing a ghost, "that in the days before little Esperanza died, she saw this man. He was lurking in the courtyard when the family was away. She thought it was strange. He moved so quietly, like a cat, not like an administrator going about his business. He was always watching the girl." The image was terrifyingly clear, the trusted employee, the man who smiled at the family over dinner, was secretly stalking their child within the walls of their own home. Doña Remedios paused, taking a shaky breath as if the weight of the memory was a physical burden. "But there is more," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The night Esperanza disappeared, my grandmother was working late, finishing a dress for Doña Isabel. It was very late, after midnight. She saw him. She saw this man leaving the house through a side gate." The old woman's eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for the woman who had carried this vision to her grave. He was carrying a large, heavy sack over his shoulder, a burlap sack. My grandmother said it was large enough to hold a child. The words hung in the air, brutal and horrifying. And he was not heading toward the city center. He was heading toward the river, toward the port. The monstrous crime was finally laid bare. It was a portrait of pure predatory evil. Vega had seen the pendant. He had recognized its potential significance. He had stalked the child, trying to learn where she had found it. When the innocent girl either couldn't or wouldn't tell him, he had silenced her forever. He had murdered an 8-year-old girl, placed her small body in a sack, and under the cover of darkness, carried her across the city to dump her in the river, staging the scene to look like a tragic accident. Then, he had returned to the house, feigned grief with the family, and likely used the chaos of the following days to search for the other 2 pendants. Before finally robbing his employers and vanishing, a wave of cold fury washed over Carmen. But one final crucial question remained. How did he get away with it? A man carrying a heavy sack through the streets at night. An employee disappearing with a large sum of money right after a child's suspicious death. How could the authorities have missed it? "Did your grandmother not tell the police what she saw?" Carmen asked gently. A look of profound, ancient bitterness crossed Doña Remedios' face. "Oh, she tried," she said, her voice laced with the remembered injustice. "She went to the Guardia Civil the next day, her heart breaking for that poor family. She told them everything she had seen." The old woman shook her head slowly. The officer, who took her statement, he listened patiently, and then he told her that she was a poor, uneducated seamstress. He told her that Mauricio Vega was a respected man, with influential friends. He told her that if she knew what was good for her, she would forget what she thought she saw and stay away from matters that did not concern her. And there it was, The final sordid piece of the puzzle. The crime was not just the act of one evil man. It was enabled and protected by a corrupt system. Mauricio Vega had not just murdered a child. He had used his power and influence to silence the one witness who could have brought him to justice. The Guardia Civil, the very institution meant to protect the innocent, had instead protected the guilty, dismissing the testimony of a working-class woman to shield an influential criminal. The rot in Seville was not just in its criminals, it was in its foundations. Doña Remedios took Carmen's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. "My grandmother carried that guilt until the day she died," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She always believed that if she had been braver, if she had been from a better family, maybe they would have listened. Maybe they would have found the man who killed little Esperanza." In that moment, Carmen understood that her investigation had uncovered not one, but two victims of Mauricio Vega, the child he had murdered, and the woman he had silenced, condemning her to a lifetime of guilt and fear. The legal and societal repercussions were clear. There were none. Justice had not just been blind, it had been bought and paid for, leaving a legacy of unpunished evil and a truth that had been forced into silence for more than 100 years. Carmen left Doña Remedios' apartment and stepped back out into the brilliant Seville sun. But the world felt irrevocably altered. The light seemed harsher, casting deeper, sharper shadows on the ancient cobblestones. The weight of the truth she now carried was no longer an intellectual burden. It was a physical presence, a cold, heavy stone lodged deep in her chest. The story was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It was a profound tragedy to be mourned, a violation that had echoed silently through the corridors of time. She held in her mind the complete, horrifyingly clear image: a trusting child, a predatory guardian who was a monster hiding in plain sight, a brutal and calculated murder, and a century of silence, enforced by the twin pillars of corruption and fear. Her final duty, she knew, was not to the archives or to the abstract concept of history, but to the two women who formed the beginning and the end of this story: Elena Mendoza, the living inheritor of the pain, and Esperanza, the child whose stolen voice had finally, after 100 years, been found. The return to the Mendoza house was a somber pilgrimage. The grand entryway, which had once seemed merely old, now felt funereal. She met Elena not in the dusty attic of discovery, but in the formal sitting room, a space of velvet curtains and polished wood, a room designed for polite, civilized conversation that was about to become the stage for a brutal, uncivilized truth. The air was still and heavy with unspoken anticipation, thick with the ghosts of all the conversations that had avoided this very moment. Carmen, looking into Elena's expectant, fragile eyes, knew she could not soften the blow. She owed this woman the terrible respect of the unvarnished truth. Carefully, methodically, as if presenting evidence in a trial that was a century overdue, she laid out the entire story, piece by damning piece. She presented the employee records, the photograph of Mauricio Vega with his confident, deceptive smile, the newspaper clippings that chronicled his pattern of predatory theft. She recounted Doña Remedios' chilling testimony, her voice steady as she spoke of the lurking shadow in the courtyard, of the heavy burlap sack carried into the starless night. She spoke of the Guardia Civil's dismissal, of the institutional rot that had guaranteed a killer's freedom. As Carmen spoke, the carefully constructed myth of the Mendoza family, the very foundation of their collective memory, began to fracture. The story of the tragic accident, The gentle, sorrowful narrative that had been used for over a century to cauterize the gaping wound of Esperanza's death was systematically demolished. It was a painful, agonizing demolition, stripping away the comfort of a sad but simple lie to reveal the complex, monstrous truth beneath. Elena listened in absolute, rigid silence, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. Her face, a roadmap of a long and dignified life, seemed to crumble inward. The tears, when they finally came, were not loud or hysterical. They were silent, relentless streams that carved new, glistening paths through the delicate wrinkles on her cheeks. They were tears for the little girl she had never known, but also for the generations of her family, her parents, her grandparents who had lived and died with a lie. Their grief misdirected, their anger without a target, their sorrow forever incomplete. When Carmen finished, the silence that descended upon the room was profound, absolute. It was the silence of a tomb that had just been unsealed, letting in the first painful rush of light. So, he watched her. Elena finally murmured, her voice a raw, broken whisper that seemed to be torn from her very soul. In her own home, he smiled at my great-grandparents, and he was watching their child. The ultimate horror was not just in the act of murder, but in the chilling intimacy of the betrayal. The monster had not come from the shadows of a dark alley. He had been invited into the heart of their home, had eaten at their table, had been entrusted with their lives and the life of their most precious child. In that moment of devastating clarity, the memory of Esperanza was irrevocably redefined. She was no longer a passive, tragic victim of a cruel twist of fate. She was reborn in the family's history as a bright, curious, and tragically brave little girl who had made a discovery she could not possibly understand. A girl who had stood, however briefly and innocently, in the path of a ruthless man's greed and had been extinguished for it, for Elena. The pain of this new truth was excruciating, but it was also, in a strange and terrible way, a form of liberation. The vague, shapeless sorrow that had haunted her family for a century now had a face and a name, Mauricio Vega. The injustice was no longer a sad, poetic mystery. It was a concrete, infuriating crime. The family story, built for so long on a foundation of tragic loss, was now being rebuilt on a foundation of righteous anger and profound, belated, and finally, honest grief. The legacy of that day's revelations rippled outward, altering the past and reshaping the future in ways both small and profound. For Elena Mendoza, the house was no longer just a collection of assets to be sold, a burden from a bygone era. It was now a crime scene, a memorial, a place that held a truth both terrible and sacred. She made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not sell. Instead, she began the quiet, personal process of turning the grand old house into a private archive, a foundation dedicated not just to the Mendoza family history, but to the study of forgotten histories. It would be a place to honor the true story of her family and the little girl whose curiosity had cost her everything. The photograph, the catalyst for this entire journey, was given the place of highest honor. Elena had the original silver frame painstakingly restored, its tarnished surface polished until it shone with a brilliant, almost defiant light. It was no longer a distressing mystery hidden away in an attic. It was displayed in the main hall, a silent sentinel greeting all who entered. It was now a testament, a silent indictment of a crime that had almost been erased by time. Carmen, in the months that followed, fulfilled her own solemn duty to history. She compiled her exhaustive research, her documents, her interviews, her forensic analysis of the photographs into a detailed academic article. It was published in the prestigious Journal of Andalusian Historical Studies. The article, titled The Unseen Eye Photographic Evidence and the Silenced Crime of 1895, sent a small but significant shockwave through the historical community. It was more than just the solving of a cold case. It was a stark, meticulously documented exposé of the networks of corruption and class prejudice that had allowed influential criminals to operate with impunity in 19th century Seville. It was a story of how power could silence truth, and how an inanimate object could, a century later, scream it from the rooftops. And what of the villain of the story? The man with the confident smile. Official records state that Mauricio Vega was never seen in Seville again after his abrupt departure in October of 1895. Justice, in the legal sense, never found him. He vanished from the city's records like a phantom. However, Carmen's final, dogged piece of research uncovered a bitter and infuriating epilogue. Property records from the coastal city of Cadiz show that a man matching his description, using a slightly altered name, purchased an expensive villa with a stunning ocean view in early 1896. He paid in cash. He lived out the rest of his days in opulent comfort, reinventing himself as a respectable philanthropist, a patron of the arts. He died a wealthy old man, mourned by a community that knew nothing of the monster he was. He had not just escaped justice. He had been rewarded for his crimes. His life of luxury, funded by the money he stole, and it is almost certain, by a treasure he had murdered a child to obtain. The system that was meant to protect an innocent girl had instead protected her murderer, allowing him to live a long and prosperous life. The haunting legacy of the story, however, does not end with him. It lingers like a faint perfume in the unanswered questions. Don Rodrigo's will spoke of 3 pendants. Esperanza found one. What happened to the other 2? Are they still hidden somewhere within the ancient bones of the Mendoza house, waiting for another curious hand to find them? Or did Mauricio Vega, in the chaotic days after the murder, managed to find them, and the legendary treasure they led to the complete truth of that treasure, like Vega himself, seems to have vanished into the mists of history? It remains a lingering secret, a final, tantalizing mystery, a reminder that the past never, ever yields all of its answers. Ultimately, this is a story about the nature of justice and the astonishing resilience of truth. The justice system of 1895 failed. It failed catastrophically. It failed the terrified seamstress who tried to speak out. And it failed the child who was so brutally murdered. But a century later, a different, more patient kind of justice was served. It was not a justice of courts and prisons, but a justice of memory and history. It was a justice delivered by the unwavering, mechanical eye of a camera. The photograph, taken on that crisp autumn day in 1895, was a profound accident of history. The photographer, intending to capture a simple family portrait, had unknowingly captured the key piece of evidence in a murder. The camera, a machine of glass, wood, and silver nitrate, had no agenda. It did not care about power, influence, or corruption. It simply recorded what was there. It saw the tiny pendant hidden in the lace, a detail the human eye had missed, and it preserved that truth with perfect, cold objectivity for more than 100 years. It held the secret, waiting patiently in the dark, for someone with the right eyes to finally see it. In the end, the story of Esperanza Mendoza leaves us with a profound and unsettling question. In a world where human systems, law, government, even memory itself can be so easily corrupted, where the voices of the powerless can be so easily silenced, What is our most reliable witness? Perhaps it is technology itself, the unblinking, impartial lens of a camera, the cold, hard data of a historical record. These are the silent guardians of our collective memory, preserving the truths that we, in our greed and our fear, try so desperately to bury. The photograph of the Mendoza family is a stark and timeless warning that evil often wears a mask of respectability, and that the most terrible secrets are not always hidden in the darkness. Sometimes they are hidden in plain sight, captured in the innocent, knowing eyes of a child, waiting for the right moment for justice, however delayed, to finally be done.